Welcome to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Life Behind Bars, where we discuss all things prison and crime. I'm Joel, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Officer Goodwin.
Yeah, Graham's name.
and Joel Campbell.
Hi.
Okay, so this week, episode 1, our very first full episode, and we're going to start right at the very, very beginning with a simple question: why do we have prisons?
Want an answer?
Well, that's the ideal part of the show, I think, is people are going to be sat there kind of just...
Well, I think.
Well, there's multiple reasons, isn't there? So,
Well,
except protection of the public.
Yeah.
Incarceration would be the first one that it gets mentioned and what a lot of people think about.
I-
And then you have rehabilitation and...
Bit of deterrent thrown in there as well. Don't do
Yeah.
this, you come to jail. But I think we need to go back in history a little bit, because we didn't always invent prisons for those reasons, did we? Because you think of castles that lock people up, and all.
Yeah.
If you go right back in history, it would have been purely not just about it would have been about control as well. When kings and lords were locking people up, they weren't doing it because you necessarily committed a crime. They were doing it because they needed to control people. And I'll decide what's a crime. I'll decide who sends up and gets tortured and pulled to pieces and stretched to make confessions.
Bloody hell, it's gone deep quick, isn't
Henry
it?
VIII, Henry VIII's a classic example. They didn't go to the Tower in London to sit there and get 3 meals a day and go out on the exercise yard, did they? So when you think of the history of it, they weren't really prisons as we understand them today, meant to be for the benefit of society, to help society for the very things that Emma said, about keeping people safe by locking people up for a long time, about rehabilitation, if that's a thing that we can manage to get to, and about using it as a deterrent, not just for them, but for public in general, to see the punishments that may be coming their way.
Okay, so prisons have changed over the years. So originally, let's step back 400 years. If we go back to 1625, when 1610, I think it was, when King James I decreed that every county should have a county jail, should have a prison in the county. So then they built a prison in every single county in the UK, which actually I don't think we have anymore. But so that was done like that. So pre that, effectively, we were utilising, there were some jails still, there were some prisons, or jails with a G as they were known back then, but they were still utilising castles, which was literally just effectively a hole in the ground.
Yeah.
Dungeons or something.
Yeah. I mean, there's one in Shrewsbury Castle, which is literally just a hole. We've been to Warwick Castle, where they've got a great one that you can go and visit and sort of see what that's like.
Lancaster Castle, which existed as a prison right the way up until about 2013, 2014.
Yeah. So those are kind of like, so that's a case of, right, somebody's broken a law. It's whatever the law might be. We'll come back to that. They've broken the law and they're just chucked in the dungeon, basically, and that's it. Yeah. No sentence particularly, no kind of you're in here for, I don't know, was it you're in here for 30 days, you're in here for a year, you're just in there until...
I often wonder whether there was a national format of laws in those days, and whether laws were mostly created by those powerful lords and people that lived within those and controlled those areas. Because you were just coming out of...
It was monarchy driven though, so the king or queen could just go, this is what's going to happen, and everyone has to follow.
To a degree,
But then you'd also have people within each area, like the lords or the... I don't know what they'd have been called, my history's not that fantastic.
Dukes.
That would have been like kind of in command of that area. That would have
Dukes and barons and all those people.
Stuff like that, so there wouldn't have been like a trial process, it would have been a case of that person's decided.
Okay, so that's to take people, that's to effectively either to punish or to remove from society. Those are the two things.
And who created judges? What were judges in those days as opposed to what they are today? Because we know they're official people that are meant to be independent and chosen independently. Whereas in those days, it might have been the local baron that decided who was going to be the justices. Or they might have been... So they would have decided right the way up until the 1800s who lived and who died. There was no... This is a standard sentence across the country. If you think about the even 17 and 1800s, when we were transporting people, judges decided who went and who stayed. They didn't go, there's a national list here. Oh, for that offence you must go to Australia for 14 years. They probably said, well, no, I don't like you. This is the second time I've seen you. So that's a death sentence for you, but you can go to Australia for 14 years. Because I haven't seen you twice. And
because you sent me to Australia.
Bearing in mind that was probably, in their mind, a fate worse than death. to go out to the American colonies and to go to the Australian colonies, when you think about it in those terms.
Well, yeah, because it's just such a long
over
time.
200, well, about 240 offences up until the 1830s. You know, like I say, I say to my audience, a young girl of 8 years old was hanged for stealing loaves of bread.
Yeah, that's it. Then we'll come on to executions, I'm sure, at some point throughout the series. So we're effectively saying, I think what we're saying, originally prisons were used to as a punishment, because you're going into somewhere that's just really nasty. You're not going to get fed. You're probably going to die whilst you're in there. So it's almost a death sentence anyway. And it is, my assumption is, I wasn't alive back then, obviously, is to remove you from society so you can't commit further crime.
Yeah.
If we then fast forward 150 odd years, or a couple of hundred years, we go through prison reform, and that's when we start kicking into rehabilitation, so modern day prison. Because if we fast forward right to where we are now, modern day prisons exist for what?
I suppose you could give it it's really hard to define it right down, but you're saying that it's to benefit society. Prisons are there for the benefit of society in the whole. So it's about protecting the majority of people, and you'll always have to accept in a society there will always be a minority of people that will go against the rules and regulations and the moral values that we've set in society at this moment in time. In that sense, yeah.
That's where you kind of start to question the purpose of prison, isn't it? Because it's like one of those things is deterrent, but it's like, well, it's like over half of violent crimes are committed by 1% of the population. So therefore, is deterrent really working?
I know.
If they're...
Well, that gets right down to the question, do prisons work for many people? Depends on... because I always say that over 46% of our population serve 6 months or less in jail.
Yeah, which is a great point.
What are you doing with people for 6 months or less? Yeah. Many are serving 2 or 3 weeks.
Well, I really want to pick that up on you with the conversation that I'd had with a prison governor and with currently serving officers, about their thoughts about how certain crimes and how they should be done. It was really interesting, because I think that the people that are on the ground doing it and living it daily actually probably will make better decisions than the politicians and the civil servants sat in Westminster making these decisions based on what they're reading and kind of those experiences, because they know. But let me before we go on to that though, so as I understood it from our discussions pre-show, we've got things like prevention, which is to keep society safe. So we put prisoners in prisons to keep society safe.
So they can't commit the crimes again.
Yeah, we have punishment. So the punishment, and this is a controversial one, and we'll get onto that maybe in the second third of our show, which is around punishment and what is the punishment? Is the punishment how you get treated when you're in prison, or is the punishment the fact you're removed from society? We'll come back to that. There's a big one I know. There's deterrent. So does society look at prisons and kind of go, well, if I do that, I'm going to end up here, therefore it operates as a deterrent? And then there's probably, I don't know, I guess it depends where you sit on the fence, but I would say maybe one of the biggest impacting factors, or one of the big things, is the rehabilitation side. It's about what do you rehabilitating do with people that are criminals, effectively.
What do you do with people once you've got them incarcerated?
So those are kind of the four big ones, I guess. There's many. Where do you want to start?
Well, you said obviously you went straight from history to modern day of rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the middle there was a bit where it focused much more on punishment.
All right, well, let's start. Let's start.
But they improved conditions from those early dungeon days to gradually make.
When you think of John Howard, who was the commissioner of this prison, with the last one before he died,
prison reform,
even though he was a believer in what they call the separate system, which meant locking you up and keeping you in a cell separate from all the others, they still believed in giving you some kind of labour.
Right, well, just explain for people very, very quickly then, Graham, in not a too full tour sense, the difference between a Georgian prison, which is what we were talking about, kind of Georgian prisons really took over from from that kind of hole in the ground, effectively, is what Georgian prisons became kind of the first.
It became much more nationalised in the way it operated.
And then we move into the Victorian before we move into here. So just explain very quickly for people that won't know potentially what Georgian prison setup looked like, people in cells and stuff, to Victorian prison. So a big difference in the regime.
Well, it would have been commonly for in the Georgian system, as I said, believers in the separate system. But it wasn't exclusively separate. It really still had a bit of a mixture of old and new. So there were sometimes in our old Georgian prison where there was a workhouse built inside the walls here. which is like coming to prison for being poor. And there was also for the very wealthy, because we classed our prisoners by class. So upper class prisoners that were coming in, might be for debt, because there was no limited companies in those days, would be in jail until they paid their debt. Debtors. So it was a debtor's prison as well. And then the separate system would have been probably kept for criminal element, what they call the people that actually committed those offences and were convicts or felons, as they called them in those days. And then there was a mixture of all those things. But when we moved into the early 1800s, you'll remember a name called Elizabeth Fry. And she had a different view of the way that it should be done. And she was probably one of those prime movers that believed in some kind of beneficial education to a prisoner in jail. So that's when they started to drift away from what they call the separate system, and this is the early 1800s, 1830s, and move into what you call the silent system. So they still believed in, it was still harsh by our standards, of course. Yeah. Unless you were spoken to, you didn't speak to people. Yeah. But you were allowed then to be with other prisoners. You could work with them, you could exercise with them, and you could actually go to church. Remember, all these things were compulsory, because their version of education was, you will go to church and listen to the word of God and read the good book. These things were compulsory for prisoners to do, as would be out doing something useful. Remember, their version of what's useful may not be our understanding. When you think they still had the treadmills. Yeah. Treadmills, boring. So there was an element of education, religious mostly based, and there was also an element of pure punishment. But that's not the definition we use today of why people come to jail. And I don't know whether it's just the time to say.
Oh, it's that. Let me just make sure that's clear for people, because I'm conscious. We talk about it a lot. We get it because we live and breathe this pretty much every single day, and we have done for years. The Georgian system was, as you very much say, was separated to a degree by class. You had a first class section, a second class section, a third class, which is basically different classes of society in jail based on your crime. You then had additional pieces, like you'd have had a debtor's jail, for example. You'd have had a workhouse, transportation. But everybody would be piled in those sections. Within those sections, you'd have had men, women, and children in together in a single cell. 13, 14, 15 in a cell. People were dying of dysentery, dying of disease, dying of abuse. If you imagine that you've got 6 big guys in their 30s and a couple of women and 4 children in a cell together, and they're all criminals.
Technically,
they're third.
You've really got 5 different style of prisons all inside one wall. Yeah. Completely different.
It's not like the Ryanair style of flights where everyone's the same.
Everybody's the same.
It's literally a class system.
And the level of criminality, the types of crimes that the so-called felons would have committed would be varied, because it was done on class, not on.
Exactly. Yeah, with a couple of changes with the debtors bit, which would normally be slightly wealthier prisoners, for example, to a degree, because they've got themselves into debt with businesses.
Well, the debt system before they brought out limited companies was basically you were personally responsible for any debt in business, and they would hold you there until you sold off your land.
We call it directors' guarantees these days.
Sold off your land, sold off your businesses, and we've got a certificate somewhere of a bill that was given to a prisoner for their time in prison, and it was a debtor's bill. I think it was £6. 9 shillings and so many pence, and that would have been a huge sum of money in those days, but they would have been treated very well. They would have had really good food brought in by their people. There was nothing wrong with that.
I think we should hold on to that for the moment, for maybe not the later today, but later in the series. The fact that there was a time where prisoners were given a bill for being in prison.
Yeah, particularly the debtors and stuff like that. Yeah.
So we've got that. That's the Georgian era. Very much dark, very much sort of still dungeony based. Treatment was awful. People came to jail, pretty much a life sentence.
Sanitation would have been appalling.
Move into the Victorian era, and we move to a single cell accommodation style.
Mostly.
Men and women beginning to be separated into different wings. Not the same cell, but different wings.
That sort of was much later on, because local prisons literally right up until the 1900s would have held women in the same prisons as men, but separate wings. Like Shrewsbury classically, C wing, it was for women, but it was in 1921 when the government said, we don't need to be doing that, we need to separate people from. Holloway was a slightly different example in London. It was a mixed prison until 1902.
We'll come on to that one as well, because I'm sure we'll talk more about the difference between male and female prisons, which I know, you've got some I guess some thoughts and some knowledge in. There's a huge difference between male crime and female crime, and the amount of prisoners as well that are actually in prison. Anyway, move on. So we have that, and then we get to Victorian era, which is, like you say, it's here's the Bible. You're going to get you're going to effectively rehabilitate through the word of God.
Yeah, and silence.
And then we move on to more recent rehabilitation,
which is more about providing a lot more support to prisoners so that when they are released, they're in a better position to become part of the community in a kind of more healthful way, and they can look at different education and they can do programs that are met to their needs. So whether it's around thinking skills or anger or different kind of emotional things, depending on what the offence is and what their needs are, they can do programs to help manage their thinking. And then the education side of it, there's a vast amount of education, from basic learning to read and write to degrees or doing more hands-on skills like building workshops or plumbing and things like that. So that can help. The question then comes when they're doing 2 to 3 weeks in prison, what you can then put in place and how much more follow-up there should be to support them when they're reintegrated into society.
It's an interesting point, that, because when you think about, right the way back to the 1930s and 40s, prisoners were doing reasonably good quality training. Well, we mustn't think that it's new. It's different today because we've added new things in. Mental health issues, anger management, cognitive skills. These probably didn't exist in the 30s and 40s. We've got photographs somewhere in one of our workshops in the 1940s.
Yeah.
And the prisoners there have got a trades officer teaching prisoners to do woodwork and bricklaying and all those. So it's not new. It's over nearly 80 odd years old, or coming up for 80 years old. And there would have been a very, what we call standardised education, I think, wouldn't it? It would have been English, maths, and those what you call core subjects that would have been done in a classroom setting. And then, Emma's quite right, then we moved on and started to recognise, because the people that were coming in changed as well. When you think of the old-style prisoner, there are far more mental health issues coming in, or at least more recognised mental health issues coming in. But there was far more drug addiction prisoners coming through our doors now, and there are far more prisoners coming through with self-harm and suicidal issues and problems that need to be dealt with in jail. So we've changed the emphasis. We still do the vocational training, we still do the educational training, as Emma said, sometimes right up to degree level, depending how long you're spending in jail. But we've had to add other stuff in there, like AA, drug awareness courses, anger management courses, domestic violence courses, things like debt management courses, how to manage money. It's right down to writing CVs and doing interviews. And the big one in prison is called cognitive skills, based on psychology, but how we think about the deficits that we need to address, I suppose. But
providing them the skills and the tools to be able to manage themselves and what's going on in society, and what else is going on in their lives, because there's always problems in life, but you need the tools and the skills to be able to manage that. Yeah. And if we can provide those, if prisons can adequately support people, then they're in a better position to cope when they get released.
Yeah. But it's the management, it's them managing their own risks, isn't it, and all that. But then we move on to the length of sentence, because to achieve some of those things, you can't do it in a week, and you can't do it in a fortnight, and you can't do it in 2 months. Yeah. You're asking people to change in 2 to 3 months of a prison sentence that may have taken many, many years to instill into them as a conditioning part of their growing up and the life where they live. So the reality is, said 46% of our prisoners serve less than 6 months. What do you do with people? Sometimes by the time you've got them onto the detox program, they're on their way home.
Are they serving less than 6 months because it's first crimes and therefore they're not given very long, or are they serving that because the type of crime doesn't have a hugely long sentence? No, is it because we have the you have to forgive me, I can't remember what it's called, but we effectively have a cut-in-half system. You get sentenced to 12 months, you're probably going to serve 6.
It changes once you get to 7 years sentence, and depending on the crime, it's now changed again, only just recently. But on average, prisoners serving 4 years would be expected to do 2 of them and then released on licence. Yeah. So they're still technically a prisoner out of jail.
They're outside for the final 2 years.
But there are rehabilitation things available when they're on licence.
Mm-hmm. But magistrates are limited to what they can sentence. They're already limited to 12 months maximum based on 2 sentences. They cannot give a 12 months for a single sentence. So they can make it 12 months by saying 6 months for that offence and 6 months for that offence. And that'll be 12 months. They are thinking of changing that and giving magistrates the option of up to 2 years. But I believe that's purely been done to ease up the Crown Courts. Now, even magistrates can go, I believe this sentence is worthy of more than I can give, so I'm sending you up to Crown Court, where the judge up there has the power to give you longer than what I'm limited to give you. But many offences would fall right there within that. And I believe there are pressure on magistrates to lock up prisoners for the least amount of time, because technically that's what you should be doing.
Yes.
You should be looking to lock prisoners up for the least amount of time, not the maximum amount of time.
Which I think is a good thing if there's support outside to make sure, because I think rehabilitation should be the focus. I think punishment, deterrent is a part of it. The punishment is that kind of taking away freedoms. You're not with your family, you don't have quite the same liberties and choices and things. But
the punishment is taking you out of society, so you can't go, I want to go to the pub tonight, or I want to go and do this, or
sit on the sofa and watch a film with your family.
The definition is loss of freedom.
But what's the point of punishment if you're not rehabilitating? Because you're still then churning out people that need help, because at the end of the day, they're people that need help.
I guess it comes back down to the crime, doesn't it? There's certain crimes that we should.
But then you
There's certain crimes that we would go, or society may go, that person, there's no point in rehabilitating them. They're too far gone. They're going to be in prison for the rest of their life. Therefore, why don't we punish them in a different way? Punishment is not necessarily removing them from society. Maybe we should be, doing other forms of punishment like we used to.
Well, that's a debate that we may get some response on from all that. But when you look at that sort of program of rehabilitation and looking sort of get prisoners to do different things, that's perfectly correct too. But there's a bigger question that we should ask generally about who are the people that are committing the bulk of the crimes, and that may be about society. So it's not by accident that the largest amount of people in jail come from what we term, I'm not always a big fan of this expression, the lower socio-economic groups. Those that have got the least advantages coming on their life, those that have the most disadvantages, who are least likely to benefit from anything that's in their life. Because let's be honest, how many wealthy people do you see in jail? Yes, we have them. They only make up a tiny, and their offences are very often different. They're not car thieves. They're not dealing drugs on the street. They're not doing those things, wealthy people. They're either big fraudsters, or they might commit a violent crime, of course. Murder and rape doesn't go beyond, there's no barrier on those, of course. But the other kind of crimes, they don't have a problem with mobility and education. They've already got that. So their crimes are distinctly different. And usually the very wealthy people, or the wealthy people come in, you don't see them return to prison in the same way as you see the lower economic groups. In and out, in and out, in and out. And that's a lack of probably proper backup rehabilitation. Once they step out these doors, where are they going? Right back to the world they stepped in from, particularly drug addicts.
Well, John, there's a really interesting point there. I think what we'll do is let's take a quick 30 seconds so we can hear from our sponsors, because we have to have sponsors of the show, because it's how we live.
Absolutely.
Graham's like, what? You guys sponsor? I get paid? No. So let's take a quick break just to hear from our sponsors, and then we'll come back and let's talk more about punishment and prevention.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Unlock the past and discover what life was like at Shepton Mallet Prison. Relive the history of past prisoners over the last 400 years. Experience what a Victorian prison cell was like for those incarcerated. See where executions were carried out. Walk the landings and prison wings. You'll hear stories of those who worked and lived behind its high walls. See it, touch it, feel it on a journey of discovery at the nation's oldest prison. Visit SheptonMalletPrison.com today to find out more.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Right, okay, so we're now going to talk around prevention, and we're going to talk around punishment and a little bit of deterrence. What I wanted to frame very quickly was, this is something that actually you'd said, Graham, you'd said it to me, I've heard you say it a number of times in tours, but it's that prison in itself, in the way it is a reflection of society. What happens in prison is effectively what happens in society. They are the same. The difference, and I think where people maybe don't see it, because we don't if we don't look at it, is in society, 99.9% of people don't commit crimes. They don't break the law. There is a percentage that do, and that breaking of law varies from people, breaking traffic law in terms of driving too fast, all the way through to maybe stealing your chocolate bar, all the way through to murders and big crimes, and everything in between. The difference is that when you have a prison, you have the same basis of society. The difference is the people inside prison is that tiny population of they're all criminals, effectively. There will be some innocent people in prison. I'm just going to put that out there before we get slated for saying everyone is guilty. But well, everyone is guilty that's in prison, but some might not have committed crimes.
If the law says they're guilty, you can only operate on what the law says.
Yeah, so that's maybe a different subject for a different day. God, Twitter's going to go crazy on that comment. But what you end up with is that small percentage of society all in one place, which therefore magnifies and compounds the problems inside prison, which is why people think there's so many problems inside prison, but actually the problems in prison already exist in society. It's just the percentage is much smaller.
If you squeeze people into a small space and you've got all those people coming in and they're all different, absolutely different, you're going to create a pressure cooker eventually, and you're going to squeeze them all in. So you're trying to deal with everybody. As a prison officer, an ex-prison officer, I was trying to deal with everybody that come in, and they're all completely different. They've got different emotions, they've got different levels of education, they've got different levels of intelligence, they've got different moral values, but each one of those people I have to manage, and they're all in the same place. And there's an assumption that all prisoners are on one side and all staff are on the other. It's just not true. So these prisoners have got problems. They always say, they get TVs and they get all these things, they get too much. That isn't their problem. That isn't the problem in prison for prisoners. It's each other. All that problems you've got with violence and people self-harming and debt and all that stuff going on there is what's going on amongst themselves. And the staff in there are trying to do something about something that's extremely difficult to manage. And it's much more complex today in prison than it ever was.
Let me ask you this about punishment.
I don't know if it's much more complex than it ever was. It's just that we now actually deal with some of those issues, whereas like way back in history, no one even...
No, I preach it in history.
These things weren't...
Mental health wasn't a thing in 1870.
No, it didn't exist.
No knowledge of these things,
But I'm certainly talking about from the 1900s up to now. If you take a look, there wasn't the problem with drug addiction in prisons that there is today. There may have been some element of mental health issue, but I do honestly believe that mental health issues are increasing in this country, not just being recognised, which many of them are now quite rightly being recognised, they're actually increasing. And that may be about society, the pressures that we put on people, the way we live our lives, who we are as a society. Remember, that may be affecting mental health as well. And then mental health affects decisions, doesn't it?
There's a lot of expectation about who you should be and
who you should be, But that's a whole argument about media. And
social media's got a lot to answer for. Let's not slate it just yet, because that's how we're going to promote the show. But you're absolutely right. And that takes time in any change, any cultural change, wherever it may be, however it's placed, it takes time to have an effect. And as that pendulum swings, sometimes it can swing too far one way and it has to then come back a balance. And social media's almost gone that far. And ideally, the policing of social media should come back. But it is about that. But
I hope we get the chance to deal with social media and crime, because I've got certain views about those things. But when it comes, it may not be a subject for now, because we're dealing with the basics of prisons rather than the intricacies.
Let me just pull you back to punishment, because I think this will be a big one for people, because I speak to people all the time that say we should just chuck them in, lock them up, throw away the key. We had this discussion on Saturday morning. There's the idea of just put them in a cell, lock them up, chuck the key into the river type of stuff. Don't give them TVs, don't give them PlayStations. They're ridiculous. They live better than people on the outside, which to a degree is true. Prisons are heated. They have TVs. There are games consoles. They're given food every day, healthcare, gyms. Everything that kind of comes around. There is definitely a lot of people, and that percentage is getting bigger and bigger and bigger in society, that do not have the same I'm going to use the word privileges. They do not have the same privileges that people in prison might do. They have the option to be able to walk out the door and go down the road and go to the shop and go to the pub. Might not be able to afford to.
I don't think that that's about prisons shouldn't have these. It's the fact that society should have more of the, you know, people shouldn't be in a position where they can't afford heating and things like that. And that's not saying that, because they haven't got it, they shouldn't have it.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not disagreeing with that.
And then we're going back to the definition of what prisons are for. And today it says it's a loss of freedom, not a punishment.
Let me put it this way. I'm not disagreeing with you. I think you're absolutely right. That shouldn't happen in society. But the fact is, it is happening in society. That is where we are right now. So why don't we turn off the heating inside prisons, save that money for the taxpayer, and put it into paying the heating bills for people that can't afford to, that haven't committed crimes?
Because you're going to ask what effect you're going to create.
See, prisoners will get cold.
Yes, we always have, people always have solutions. Everybody's got an idea in their own opinion of a solution to something. But the reality is it's asking about the practicalities of a solution. What is the point of doing something that if the end result of what you've done is going to cause you more problems than what you think you're doing is a right thing? It might be great to give all that people that money, but then you've got to start dealing with this, and you're going to ask, so will people just sit in their cells then? Will they not riot? Will they not hurt and damage staff and each other because they will react to that situation, burn a prison down, and then you're going to spend taxpayers' money that you thought you saved building the next one?
No, I'm not. I'm going to play devil's advocate on that a little bit. I'm going to go a little stage further and say that because you've committed a crime, you're in prison, your punishment is you've been removed from society. People in society are getting punished in further because their taxes now have to pay for your upkeep. Now, if we moved prisoners to 2 meals a day rather than 3, it will save money. And it is going to have an impact on an individual's life, having 2 meals a day, but it's not going to put them in danger of death because they're still going to get the substance and the nutrients they need to live. It's going to reduce the money across 88,000 prisons, I think we currently have in the country. Something like that.
I think it's on about, with COVID, it dropped down to about 82 because they suspended the courts.
Somewhere.
Yeah. If we're moving back up to 85.
If we reduce the heating, which is a huge cost to run prisons, I can guarantee people of that.
Yes.
And they've already hacked into staff levels, which I'm sure you can both talk about and relate to in different ways. But if we did that, the money we save could be reallocated into people that can't afford to heat their homes or to eat this winter. That money could just be reallocated. The people in prison, absolutely, they're going to have a harder time of it, but shouldn't they maybe have a harder time of it for committing the crime in the first place? The deterrent side of things didn't work.
Well, that's the argument about whether we put people in prison because we want to do more damage than we've started in the first place.
How's that going to do more damage?
Well, because people will be more difficult to manage. If somebody's going to be cold all day, I've no illusion. Remember, I'm at the coalface, you're at the coalface when you're dealing with prisoners, and when you're dealing with people that may be cold a day and miserable and now not happy, how do I motivate them to go and actually do something positive? They're going to go, because I'm not in the mood to. That's like would you have a classroom that's cold to get children's attention? You're cold now, children, but if you pay attention and do the right thing, we'll put the heat back on for you. Yeah. They're not going to. They're just going to sit there going, I'm cold, I can't think, I can't do this.
And how do you then integrate them back into society? Because you're creating that divide. You treat people how you want to be treated to a certain extent. Yes, we have to have certain elements of the system there to keep other people safe, but if you want them to start to recognise authority as part of society rather than this us and them, then
I guess you guys are using the carrot, I'm using the stick.
Well, yes, absolutely. But the very first thing that you said is about, it's not about, I think you said it, it's not about taking stuff because pensioners or old people or poor people don't have stuff. Then we're living in a society which is a little bit like, oh, well, if I can't have it, nobody else can have it either. And you go, no, the answer is you should have it. Yeah. And society should make sure you have it. It's as simple as that. People shouldn't have to be sitting there saying, well, I don't have it, they shouldn't have it. That's just the politics of envy and anger and revenge and pain. And people shouldn't have to.
What's the benefit of giving prisoners TVs and computer consoles. Let's stick with TVs, for example, because I've got and kettles in their sense.
Well, I remember when TVs first came out, and it would be a typical classical reaction by staff that have been accustomed for prison having no more than a radio in their cell.
Yeah.
I said, why give them radios? Well, they decided to do that long before. But on reflection, whether we like it or not and whether we think it's right enough, they are pacifiers. Not only does it pacify prisoners, we use them to pacify our children. We use them to pacify ourselves because we sit down in the evening and watch programs. And they're no different. So as far as that's concerned, TVs that we found as staff, and most staff may or may not agree with that if they're watching this, they become pacifiers. So when you're having to lock prisoners in cells sometimes, through no fault of their own, because there's no work available and or there's things
Well, I would
on.
say it is fault of their own because they've committed a
No,
crime first
I'm talking about
themselves in prison.
No, I'm talking about while they're in prison.
Yeah,
They can't work in prison not because they're not willing to, it's because we don't have the availability to give it to them. So we're going to put them behind a door. And I go, then, trust me, I worked with prisoners when there were no TVs in cells, and they were. And mostly when they go behind the door, the TVs are on, and they're sitting there, and it is pacifying them to a degree. To a degree. I'm not saying that it's something that should want.
So it just gives them something to
You must teach the privileges.
And it's another one of the carrots, isn't it? Because they can lose it through.
Yeah, it's a privilege.
In prison.
So
they
people
have to
forget
pay
that
for it and
everything that prisoners have, nearly everything they get, smoking was always a privilege in prison. It's not a right. And that's why governors could take tobacco off prisoners as a punishment. There's no smoking in prisons now, and it's vapes. I don't know whether vapes are still part of the privilege system. I don't, or whether they've just made it into a
Because
automatic.
here's the thing, and with TVs, I get the carrot. You know, it's the carrot side of things, and if they misbehave or if they break the rules, and the TV comes off, their cellmate won't be very happy about it for a start. They're not going to be very happy. So it's an encouragement for them to behave better.
Well, it's called the IEP scheme. That's basic standard enhanced prisoners. Yeah. They get more privileges the higher they go.
So the better they behave, the more.
And it can float up and down.
Let me talk about TVs very quickly. There's some things there. I'll explain it now very quickly because we're in episode 1, and these things will obviously happen over time. But both of you two working in prisons, civil servants, you've both been signed into the Official Secrets Act. There'll be things that we talk about through this show that you will have to refrain, or you'll have to abstain, I guess, from talking about because you can't because you'll breach those acts. And obviously you know lots of individual things about lots of different individual prisoners. I'm not bound by those same things. But one thing that I do know in terms of prisons, with something like TV licensing, when we come to costs, a prison has to have 2 TV licenses. One for staff areas, one for prisoners. So in Shrewsbury Prison, for example, 178 prison cells. So in theory, up to 178 TVs. There'd be an officer's mess, maybe with a couple of TVs in it, type of stuff. Probably those would have been.
Yeah, that'd be about your limit.
So you could have had about 180 to 200 TVs in a prison, 2 TV licenses. So there's a thing there that I'm sure people will be like, well, that's ridiculous. Why do I have to pay my TV license when I only have 2 TVs in my entire house? But you can have this. So there's that aspect. But also, TVs cost money to run. You plug them in, they cost electric. And what we're saying is that prisoners have TVs to as a pacifier, but also they only get them once they've behaved so much. So why don't we have a system where we turn the heating off in your cell until you get to a certain level?
I know
or you have 2 meals
exactly
a day until you get to a certain level. And once you get to that level, i.e. you're behaving better, you can have the heating on in your cell or turned up to a certain level. You can have the
I absolutely understand that. And I'm going to say it for Emma because she's going to say it before me if I don't.
Jump in, go on.
Basic human rights.
That's exactly what I said.
But people on the outside don't have
remember, we are still bound by the Human Rights Act.
Yep.
We might drop out of it and create our own, but at this moment in time, basic human rights will mention those kind of things. The right to fresh air, the right to breathe,
but there's people outside right now. Is this show aired? We're recording end of September. It's going to air at the end of October. By the time we get to this airing, people are going to be choosing between eating and heating. That's going to be a reality outside. Those people have been excluded from their basic human rights based on what's happening.
But they're not being withdrawn by a physical person. Like if someone turns the heating off.
Well, they're having to do it to themselves because they can't afford to pay. And they shouldn't have to.
No, they
but
shouldn't.
They are having to. So therefore, couldn't we be turning around and saying, well, let's take the worst of society, those that are in prison because they've committed crime, and let's add to the tiering system, which is already there, it already exists in terms of how many visits you can have, how long you might be in your cell for, whether you can use the gym, whether you can have a TV. Let's just add to that heating and food.
Yeah, but things like heating, it's like that human rights side of it. If you're physically turning it off, you are depriving someone when you physically can give it.
Yeah,
where just like
we can give them a coat and blankets.
A water company can't turn the water off on your house because it's your human right.
But they can take you to court and send you to prison for not paying the bill.
Right. If you ever bother to look at the Human Rights Act, I've glanced. Like, it's very complicated.
I have.
But it'll talk about in there. Human Rights Act will talk about the treatment of prisoners as well.
Yeah.
Because they'll say, where do you stop? You have to have a baseline, and that baseline is that everybody we have to first of all assume is a human being and are deserving of those basic human rights, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of the conditions you're in. Every prisoners of war should be treated under the Human Rights Act and be entitled. Because they might say, well, why should we? That's why we have war crimes. Because they go, no. Remember, in our Second World War, there were certain elements of certain armies and services that treated prisoners of war appallingly, right down to cruelty. So the reality
still do now. We see this in the news with Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's why the Human Rights Act was built in there, to say that we need to limit that. Because where do you stop? If you say we can turn heating off, then what else might we do? What else?
Well, we reduce the meals to 2 meals a day. I know where you're going.
I
agree with that. I know. So we turn the heating off, we reduced it to 2 meals, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't work.
Yeah.
It hasn't worked. So what are you going to do now? Because you've made no effect. If it doesn't work, what you've done is ineffective. So what will you do now? You've taken, so you've got them, so 1 meal a day?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
What if I take it to 1 meal?
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Because if it doesn't work, reducing it further is not going to work. Doing the same thing,
so therefore it's pointless.
Doing the same thing, expecting a different result, is the definition of insanity. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I'm questioning, I guess I'm arguing, I'm making it difficult because I want to argue, because I like to make things difficult, is the sense of, but have we tried that? And before you answer,
yes.
Before you answer it, let me just ask you this one, because this is again something we've discussed. When you get to in the next month, when you're in the prison service, in the next month, and it's slightly different for you because the type of jail Emma was in, but for you. But for you, Graham, in the jail you're in, around this time of year, in a month's time, you would see a number of faces coming back for probably 6-month sentences, 4 to 6 months,
a bit less,
because you'd be seeing homeless people coming in because they knew they could commit certain crimes which would give them 3, 4, maybe 5 months, which would put them into a local jail. They'd get 3 squares a day in terms of 3 meals a day. They'd get access to gym, showers, heating, new clothes, and then when they leave, they'd get given a discharge grant, a travel grant, and they'd also be given potentially new clothes that fit. So people were already going, I'm better off in jail than I am in society. Where's that line now going to be, considering that the cost of living is now so much higher than it was? Is that line going to move? And are we going to have people, again, at the poor ends of society, so potentially in low-cost accommodation, in temporary housing, possibly even in council houses, go, do you know what? I'd be better off in jail.
Nothing to lose. I'd
be better off in jail.
Yeah, but it is quite conspiratorial.
Prisons are no longer a deterrent.
Yeah.
They're an encouragement.
When you think of it, it's quite conspiratorial. It's not just about that person. They don't choose to come to prison. What they do is they see an avenue that helps them. Now, years ago it used to be alcoholics on the street. It's much more drug and mental health issues living on the streets today. And they're aware of that. But there's somewhere along the line, when they turn up and do that crime, they know they're going to court. They probably know, and there may be some judges out there who are fully aware of the situation and are probably already making that decision when they could have said, no, I'm not going to lock you up. I'm just going to let you go. What? I'm just going to let you go. Why? Because there's no advantage in locking you up. But I'm cold. That's not the reason why I'm not locking you up. That's not my argument. In law, I don't think it's wrong. So you might find that there's a little bit of conspiracy going on where there are people that, all of us, that may be accepting that from our side of the fence by saying, I'll put him in for 3 months, gets him off the street, gives him a 3 meal. So there may be an element of kindness passed out by the people in authority who could have made, because that's the people that make the decision to send people to jail. Committing a crime doesn't send you to jail. Committing the crime puts you in front of a court, who then decide whether you go to jail or not. And you might not go to jail for many more offences. There are people that commit serious offences like ABH. You don't always go to jail for it.
I guess my position on it is, because we know that does happen. It may not happen in huge numbers, but
it's not a big number.
And I think that's going to happen more. And certainly we see it all the time. And we speak to lots of people that say, well, we're better off in jail than we would on the outside because we don't have this. And we see it all the time. People go, just why would you pay to go into jail to see an attraction? Our sponsors who are prisons and tourist attractions will have people say, why would you pay to go in? You just commit a crime and go for free. So that's already society's mentality to it.
Quite flippantly said, though, quite
it is.
And always by people, and very frequently, I'm not saying it doesn't happen that people commit crimes to prison, but there's people who have never actually seen real prison.
And
They've never been
people
inside.
don't necessarily think their taxes go to pay for prisons, but they do. That's how they are.
All part of the criminal justice system. Yeah.
But right at the very beginning, when we talked about the reason for prisons is to prevention, in terms of preventing people from causing more crime. Yeah. We were talking about punishment, so removing you from society for doing your crime. Deterrence in terms of society not committing crimes because they don't want to go into prison, and rehabilitation. Yeah. But surely the idea of where we are now, and I'm not saying it's right, it is the way it is, and it shouldn't be like that. Actually, there is a growing percentage of the population that would look at it and go, I'm better off being in prison. And actually, the idea that it's a deterrent for me is not a deterrent because it's looking encouraging. I'm putting myself there, so actually I'm going to get a better style of life in prison than I am out of prison. So it's no longer a punishment. You're not preventing me from doing crime. You're encouraging me to do crime. And the rehabilitation side is neither here nor there because I'm already intelligent enough to know
the difference. That's right.
But I'm going to be
taking away things like heating and food isn't necessarily going to improve things for people on the outside, though.
Well, no,
therefore, those people are still in that situation.
Well, it could do because the money that's spent on the heating and the food could be taken and allocated specifically for the poorer ends of society to help heat and feed. It could be ploughed into food banks or into energy company surplus. You know, it's a huge.
But you're working on the theory that it puts people off coming to prison. And it doesn't serve any purpose.
I wonder.
Prison serves no purpose if it doesn't go to.
But if you know you're coming to jail and you're only going to get 2 meals a day and no heating, doesn't that just increase the deterrent?
I know people that have come to jail that don't get 1 meal every 3 days. Once you start dealing into heavy drug users, they're waking. Why do you think they're 6 stone, some of these lads that come into these doors? They look like they're skeletons a couple of days away from death. Yeah. Food isn't their priority out there. Heating isn't their priority. Yeah. Drugs is. So unless you address that, they're not going to change. They don't go to jail because it's warm. They don't.
To give them the best chance of being able to take advantage of things like drug rehab programs, they need to be able to be physically well.
Yeah, there's actually a word we haven't used yet, and MPs never use this word, believe it or not. I haven't heard them use it. We'll talk about crime in the sense of punishment and rehabilitation, but you never hear them talk about crime in a preventive way.
Yeah.
You never hear them that because it's very easy to throw up longer sentences and work on what they call the populist emotions of people talking about crime and rehabilitation or talking about punishment. But they don't go, we're going to need to talk about prevention because prevention is much more difficult to get your head round. It has to start at a very, very young age. We have to change the way we look at how we manage our societies, and it may take a long time to find the results, 10 or 15 years. No politician goes beyond the next election, ever.
And that's the trouble, isn't it? There's nothing long term enough because we know that there's this huge difference between the socioeconomic kind of levels of crime. So putting more things into play in areas to help people have support is, whether that's financial, whether that's emotional, whether that's, educational, whatever it is, that is more likely to have a long-term effect on society than anything else.
I suppose the classic example would be is if you look at the Norway prison system, is it Norway? I believe it is. Yeah. When they go to prison there, it's like walking into Premier Inn. Their rooms are as big, they're probably bigger, they have many more facilities like sitting there to do their work and their education. They have big walk-in showers, very much Premier Inn style. I like Premier Inn, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, just in case.
Yeah, I do. Every time I go to Premier Inn, I'm always like, I should be brand ambassador for Premier Inn.
We've got the Freeman in there for Premier Inn. But the reality is, and yet they lock up less people than we do.
Yeah.
By some considerable amount.
Yeah,
so if you're using the argument that giving them nothing and treating them badly works, how do we explain Norway? How do we explain that?
Especially when you compare it with...
Because their society operates differently.
Yeah.
Because they're into dealing with things like good childcare.
I was going to say they have so much more support for new families and childcare.
Young care.
I'm lost, I'm done. Let's have a quick word from our sponsors and we'll be right back.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Shrewsbury Prison, Shropshire's #1 tourist destination. Step behind the gates of this 200-year-old prison and discover an unknown world. Heritage tours run by ex-officers, where you can see the cells, walk the landings, see and touch the history. But there's so much more going on. Experience one of our brilliant activities or take part in our world-renowned events. From escape rooms to axe throwing, overnight sleepovers to prison break, we do it all. And there's something for all the family, with activities starting from 8 years, events from 12 years, and heritage tours for all ages. Visit our restaurant and experience food behind bars. There really is so much to see, do and discover on a day out at Shrewsbury Prison. Visit us at www.shrewsburyprison.com.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back to Life Behind Bars. You're listening to episode 1. We're talking all about why do we have prisons. I'm going to just throw it out there because one of the things I know I'm going to find this throughout the whole series is so different having a conversation with the two of you to other people I normally have a conversation with, especially in my work environment, because when I ask you guys closed questions, which I've done at different points, I'm expecting a yes or no answer. Somehow, neither of you give a yes or no answer. You managed to do a great explanation all the way through. I sit here kind of going, I'm trying to catch them out at this point. I'm trying to get them to a fixed yes or no, but it just...
You know what they say? Never ask a closed question, because you'll never get the answer that you want.
Oh, well, maybe I'll go back to my...
That's a psychologist will tell you that. You never ask closed questions because you never find anything out.
Always.
So we were talking about why we have prisons, and I just want to say I absolutely do agree with you both. You know, I'm not somebody that sits particularly on the fence on anything. I'll always make a statement one way or the other, and I think I was putting points across to look at other angles of it. I think society's got real problems, and I think prisons are a reflection of those problems. But it does cost a huge amount of money to operate and run a jail.
Yeah.
Massive.
Yeah, we're into the billions.
Huge, huge. And there is a balance of the way society look at prisoners and go, well, that's not fair. And actually, they've given up their freedom. And we do start to tread, and that's why I wanted to mention it quickly, because you spoke just before that ad break about the Norwegian system, which very much is concentrating heavily on rehabilitation. I think there's been a couple of programs, but there was one recently. It was on Netflix. It was Miriam. I can't remember her name.
Margot?
Yes, she went to the prison system. She saw it because she was going through the canteen or the shop. Yeah. And it was like a supermarket. So she was like, this is like Lidl's.
Yeah.
And it is very much like that. And actually, we did some work with a production company at one of our prisons where they wanted to create a series which looked at 10 prison cells and 10 prisoners treated very much in the Norwegian system, and 10 prison cells and 10 prisoners treated very much like the Japanese system, which is rack 'em, pack 'em, stack 'em, lock 'em up, treat 'em badly, no rehabilitation, and in you go. And yes, the Japanese numbers of prisoners is far greater per capita than obviously the Norwegian system, actually far greater than us, and we see that in America.
Well, the champions,
which is a slightly different beast.
The champions of prisons are the United States of America.
They certainly do win the prize, without a doubt.
Trust me.
Yeah, and America, I guess, doesn't work in terms of they still have the death penalty as the most severe form of punishment, doesn't stop people committing crime. They have the deterrence, and they have more prisoners, more guns, more walls, more bars than anybody else.
But just to clear that up about America, everybody assumes that the United States has the death penalty. No, they don't.
Certain states.
There are only something like 23 states, it might be 27, I can't remember now, that carry, and out of those 20 odd that have the death penalty, only about 5 of those states
4 or 5.
actually actively carry out the death sentence. And I did some research on this probably a couple of months ago because I was fascinated to find out the states that don't have the death penalty have a lower homicide rate, as they call it in America, than the states that do. So if you talk about deterrent, you go, explain that one to me then.
Well,
they have the death penalty in more murders, they have no death penalty in less.
And that comes back round to what you were talking about in terms of, taking away certain privileges. If death penalty is not a deterrent, why is it going to take a meal?
We've got an episode coming up on the death penalty, on executions, which will cover capital punishment, public executions, non-public executions in the UK, America, different countries. So let's pick that one up there, because I think there's, and the three of us are in agreement that executions does not work as a deterrent, and the facts and the figures clearly state that. But let's pick that in a different episode. I want to really nail down into why we have prisons, and I guess the additional question is there: do we treat prisons in the way that we should? Should society actually, and this will come back to education. You spoke about it earlier. One of the rehabilitation programs you spoke about was prisoners learning about how to manage money, but we don't do that in school.
No.
I'm not sure if they do it in school anymore.
My daughter's in school. I haven't seen that on her
how to
timetable.
Talk about debt and how we create debt and how we manage debt and money.
Not and certainly not about learning about how to manage pay and taxes and mortgages and the bills and general living accountancy.
Yeah, I think personally that prison should be about that last stop to help someone whereas for that to be the true case, there needs to be much more in place at an educational level and at a family support level and a community level to prevent people getting into that situation in the first place.
Do you think, this is literally off the top of my head, if people, I know what you're both going to say, I know how people are going to laugh at me about this, do you think if the large population of society saw and understood more about how prisons work, the prison regime, in the same sense if everybody was taught about mortgages and debts and budgeting personally and stuff like that, and people were able to see more about hospitals and doctors and how that works, that actually that would make a big shift in society. So for example, I'm talking about if you took school children, it's great that they go to Roman villages and settlements, it's great they go to castles and learn all about old historic old history.
Understanding our history.
But actually, and maybe that's in part of a different lesson, but what if they went to tours of hospitals and were actually taken around a hospital by a doctor or by a surgeon and by a nurse and explained, this is how hospital works, and this is the ward where people come because they've got this disease, or maybe this is the cancer ward, and some cancers, unfortunately, people just get them. Others are caused by smoking or by drinking or by poor health, which leads into that health situation. And if we did the same thing in prisons, that every child went through a prison tour, for example, and learnt about, from prison officers and from prisoners, this is what prison's like. In the same sense, if we could do that with hospitals, we could do it with prisons, we could probably do it with police, we could probably do it in a smaller scale, but I'm not saying a small scale, but with fire. So we're kind of hitting those major pieces. Wouldn't then that have more effect in terms of why we have prisons, and also start to reduce, ideally, some of the crime, therefore some of the prisoners, some of the poor health epidemics we have, ideally support people more financially because they manage better, and therefore that will improve society. I guess the final piece is, do we not do that because no one's ever thought about it, or do we not do it because politicians only think in 4 and 8 years? And that's a generational change, because it's got to be embedded and it's got to take time for them to learn.
It's a long-term process. It's got to happen more than once. Coming round and seeing something once, you need to get it reinforced and like a lot of things do. But the trouble with society generally is that when you look at complicated things like prisons and hospitals and healthcare and social services, we have a tendency as being to simplify the problem. So it's easier for us to get our heads around it, and we can then either condemn it or support it. And you'll find a lot of people will come up with very, very similar statements, regardless, and we're talking about prisons now particularly, regardless of why these people are in jail, because they come from all walks of life with all different problems. We tend to think of them all roughly in the same way. We tend to treat them as they're all the same. And I've read it so many times on the internet. I've seen people write all kinds of stuff that people should be automatically get 10 years.
Yeah.
Automatically. I said, everybody then? Yeah. I said, we'll never build enough prisons fast enough. You know, why do you think that it doesn't work? Because they see it always as, if I punish people and tell them I'm going to really hurt them and punish them, they'll stop doing it. People don't commit crime because they expect to get caught. They commit crime because they think they're not going to get caught.
They don't even consider the consequences.
No, that's all about consequential thinking.
That's
all about
brilliant phrase.
Yeah.
Everybody in prison is bad at their job because they've all been caught. They've every single one of them bad at their job because you've been caught. Drug dealer, you've been caught.
Motivations,
you've been caught.
I've never known a burglar tap on somebody's door and make sure somebody's in before they go and burglar them. They'll always try to burgle people when they're not there. And when they go in at night time, they don't expect them to be there, or they really don't want to bump into them.
Or they're just not bothered.
And they're sneaking around. Well, it depends on the desperation of why they're doing what they're doing. Remember, people that get caught up in serious drug addiction and all that, they're really quite dangerous. Because of their desire to get that drug in their system, they don't even think of any consequences. It doesn't enter their minds. Remember, this is what they want. Yeah. That's the prime motive. That's why they don't eat very often very well. That's why they don't sleep very well. That's why every waking moment is looking for the next hit. That's their focus.
It comes back to education and society and support, because programs like, that focus on all those different areas, but just in general about how to be a part of community and support one another. An education system that was much broader about the realities of like living and being a part of society, as opposed to sit in a classroom and make sure you've got 100% attendance.
I can tell you what.
I just don't think that sets people up, and they talk about the attendance because they're talking, and there's this huge focus on attendance.
It's because of work.
Because A, they need the childcare for people to go out and work, and B, they want
a condition. So when you go to work, you turn up at work every day. You don't you pay attention. You put your hand up.
It comes back to control,
which
Graham talked about earlier. But also it's about, they started bringing in more and more focus on it, claiming that it was around forcing people to go when certain areas of people would, and again came back to socioeconomic groups, people wouldn't necessarily have their children going into school. They're more likely to skip off or skive or not go, so therefore they put more and more focus on attendance. Well, that's not going to bring that child around and give them any more support, because you're adding more and more punishment.
Forcing people into something.
I don't think we don't disagree.
I'm going to make a statement now, and I'm going to stand by it right from now to the next, as long as I can live, which I hope is going to be another 50 years, because I've got a pension to spend.
50 years.
The bigger the gap between equality in society, you can expect to find down here a bigger level of people coming to prison. I'm not justifying their behaviour and saying it's okay for them to behave like that. I'm just telling you that's the way it works. If you go back to the 18th century, the very, very poor people came to jail. But it doesn't excuse the fact that they committed a crime. But people's motivations and the way they behave and the way they believe about society. If their belief in society is they've been cast aside and no one's really caring about them, they go, so why should I worry about things then? Why should I care? Why should I care? What's in it for me?
Well, we're going to see very soon, I think, whether you're right or not, because as we record this episode...
Well, it'll pan out over 5 years ago, probably.
But a couple of days ago, obviously they announced the new mini-budget, and the new mini-budget very much supports the top 10% and above of earners. So therefore, the gap is going to get bigger. And it was only this morning, just before we recorded, that we could see the pound dropping and all the problems in it very clearly. Everybody in that top earning probably going to be okay. That gap is going to get so much bigger. Yeah. I'm conscious we're at time. We're at the end of episode 1. What I do want to ask both of you, and I'm going to ask you to try and keep your answers as tight as you can, just because of time, is: are prisons currently correct in the way that they're doing things? And if not, which part needs to change?
I think prisons are probably failing more than they're succeeding. Now, that isn't excusing the fact there are some people that need to be locked up for a long, long time, for no other reason that they need to be locked up to keep society safe. Simple as that. And we know we're talking about those very dangerous people. But at the other end of this scale, we're just not putting enough emphasis. But it does really come back to prevention. And I can't avoid that. I can't avoid saying that, because there are lots of people coming in, and we seem to be getting young people coming to the law much, much younger. They're now ending up in police stations at young ages. And already there's a danger there that if they come in and coming up into the criminal justice system, it will frame the way they think about everything else after that when you're young. So as far as prisons go, no, I think we could do things a lot better than we're doing them. But we shouldn't really be having to rely on prisons to do it. It's a really complicated answer, that one. It is. I think we should be doing a lot more in a different way.
The last thing that we should be getting to, we should be having all
the government are predicting. This is the government. Could I read it on a government website? They're predicting that we're going in by the end of 2026. They're building another 18,000 prison places. They're predicting 98,000 people. How do they know that we're going to need them? What is the basis of belief? But they should be saying, no, we want to do something to keep what we've got and get them down.
I'm not going to pick up now because we don't have
But we seem to be quite happy to put the prison population up.
There is a piece about where the government actually are better off by having more prisons and more prisoners. But that's for a different show. I'll drop that one in there as something to listen to down the line. But there is a argument, it might be a little bit kind of conspiracy theory-esque, but there is a piece that actually shows that there is, for a government, it's better to have more people in prisons, and there's a reason behind it. We see some of it in America, but we'll come back to that in a different show. Emma?
I think that rehabilitation is really important. I just don't think we go far enough, and I think a lot of that comes back to that preventative stuff. But also, when you do look at other systems, and I'm like Norway, and it's even more, I guess, people would describe it as lenient. Regulate. It's got more comfort, yet they've got a better, a reduced prison rate compared to they've got a better recidivism rate and so forth than us.
That's a word, isn't it? Recidivism.
They lock up less people and they return a lot less.
So recidivism is about the return rate. So I think we don't go far enough, and I think that does come back round to prevention as much as anything, because it's as simple as Graham just mentioned about the more prisons being built, yet social services are being cut, and these are some of the most needing children. If you want to make a change, you need to start at the beginning. And it does take generations.
Well, as you said, they're building more prisons and they can't even staff the ones they've got now.
Oh, there's huge problems.
So they'll run them on a budget, and they'll run them so they're ineffective because they wonon't have the staffing and the resources. So they're running ineffective.
To that, but we've seen. I'll drop in. We saw it with utility companies, and we're going to see the same thing with prisons, and potentially, if we're not careful, the same thing with NHS. Different point, different subject, different time. That has been episode 1 of Life Behind Bars. We've talked all about why we have prisons. If you enjoyed it, please do leave us a comment. Do throw any questions our direction. We will pick those up in the following episodes, absolutely. We will respond to all of those. If you have questions specifically for Graham or for Emma, do send them in. Don't send me your questions, send them to the people who actually know what they're talking about. I'll just talk about cutting costs. So do send in your questions. Do subscribe to it. And next week, so our next episode, we're going to be talking about serial killers. So we're going to go straight in there with episode 2 to talk about serial killers. So do join us for episode 2 where we'll be doing that. And thank you very much for listening.
You've been listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.